And so it's this kind of two-speed story here. We've got a slightly better story in the short term, but the big picture long term hasn't really changed.
Finance Minister Tito Mboweni delivered his national budget speech yesterday afternoon. But what are some of the key outcomes of the speech, and what are some of the trends that we should be looking out for in the financial year ahead? Well, joining me to discuss this is Russell Lamberti, who's an economist with ETM Macro Advisors. Russell will be briefing an exclusive CRA client webinar at 1 o'clock this afternoon. CRA clients are welcome to join us then. Russell, let's turn now to the budget. What are some of your impressions, some of the high-level trends that you took away from yesterday's speech?
Yeah, look, I think the big takeaway is that the big fiscal ship did not change direction very much from the speech. It's a huge budget, it's a huge deficit. Yes, the big news that will hit the headlines will be the positive changes in some of the outlooks from the mini budget in October. Taxes recovered more than expected. Things have been a little bit better than expected because there's been a stronger than expected global sort of bounce from the depths of the lockdown depression, if you like, that we had in the second and third quarter of last year. So a lot of the good news is not government's own doing. It's really just this kind of global rising tide that's helping South Africa a bit. At the margin, that's good news, but it's only slightly good news at the margin. We still basically are going to have run a close on 15% of GDP budget deficit for 2020 and 2021, this fiscal year. To put that in context for your listeners, a 3% of GDP budget deficit is historically considered a large deficit, right? So 15% is enormous. And we're going to continue to run extremely large deficits according to the Treasury forecast into next year. So the next fiscal year, they plan to run roughly a 10% of GDP budget deficit. So we continue to rack up enormous amounts of national debt. And I think the big story here is that while there's some sort of better news at the margin because taxes have recovered more than expected, taxes weren't raised by the finance minister. They sort of held off on aggressively raising income taxes and taxes more broadly. So there's this kind of short-term good news, but the bigger backdrop, behind the scenes here is that structural decay and decline continues. There's nothing in this budget that would tell you that the government is willing and ready to change course meaningfully and fundamentally. So it's just another budget where South Africa continues to go in the wrong direction. And one day that's going to be a problem. It's going to be a big problem one day. We don't know when. For now, it looks as though foreign investors are willing to fund South Africa's deficits. In the big scheme of things, South Africa's deficits are very small, given the tens of trillions of dollars that slosh around the global economy. South Africa's deficits are very, very small and financeable. But one day, this large accumulation of debts is going to be a problem. And so it's this kind of two-speed story here. We've got a slightly better story in the short term, but the big picture long term hasn't really changed.
Okay, Russ. So let's just put this debt burden into context. So the government expects a debt to GDP ratio for this year of about 80%, rising to about 87% over the medium-term expenditure framework. You mentioned that that's relatively modest by global standards, and there still seems to be a high appetite for SA government bonds in global financial markets. But what are some of the risks there of that growing debt burden and what it represents, not just to our public accounts, but to the stability of South Africa's economy going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we all know that you can't accumulate debt forever and indefinitely. There is always a reckoning eventually. This is the story of history. Now, it's true that these things can go on a lot longer than very often you believe they can. And I think this is almost certainly the case with South Africa. I think there's a lot of people who probably would have, if you said to them 5 years ago in 2016, maybe 2015, if you said, will South Africa be a viable fiscal entity by 2020 if it continues to not only run these deficits, but even worse deficits? Most people would have said, oh, probably not. And yet here we are getting these deficits funded, even though they're enormous. And the COVID deficit was truly huge. The long-term consequence, Dave, of this is that I mean, there's a few things. I mean, probably the big one that's actually well studied, and there's a strong academic literature behind this, is that large government debts are a huge anchor on an economy, a huge weight. They weigh economies down. Growth rates suffer substantially under large deficits. That's because deficits are really, they fuel the growth of government. So you get the growth of a very large, inefficient public sector. They also consume more and more resources in interest payments. So government really just becomes this huge, big, inefficient behemoth. So growth rates suffer. And we know already that South Africa's growth rates are incredibly poor. So the prospect of this economy actually meaningfully growing and actually surpassing the levels of GDP or output that we had prior to COVID in the near term, I mean, in the medium term even, I think are very, very low. It's very difficult for us to get out of that, sort of growth trap that we're in. So I think that's a huge concern. And then it has socio-political implications over the longer term. Future generations who get born into enormous amounts of debt, future taxpayers who are effectively liable for these debts. History tells us that when these obligations get too large for the next generation, they don't honor them. They repudiate them. They default. They print them away through inflation. But one way or another, it's very unlikely that in the long term, future generations are going to actually agree to pay off all this debt that no one asked them, whether they should, whether they would be willing to pay it. And I think that does eventually take us down the road to some kind of big, ugly event. But that event might be quite far into the future. We don't know. Certainly the way the world economy is structured right now is that there is just so much money, so much yield hungry, fairly indiscriminate sort of money buying all sorts of weird and wonderful assets. And South African government bonds are one of those. We know that we have one of the most corrupt governments in the world, and yet foreign investors are throwing money at their debt. What does that tell you about the structure of the financial system?
So, Russ, the finance minister made a great emphasis on the fact that this was not an austerity budget. What is wrong with austerity necessarily? Why is that seen as a bit of a swear word by the minister? And why is he so keen to avoid that label?
I think that he was using the word austerity in this budget speech as a bit of a pejorative to try and sort of paint any kind of cutbacks and prudence in a bad light. If you do austerity, the word austerity has come to be associated in fiscal parlance with harsh measures that actually do harm, that hurt the economy, that actually get you into a worse position and all these kinds of things. There's all sorts of reasons why I think that's untrue and why austerity has been, misdefined and mislabeled and all these sorts of things. But basically, I think he's using that word in the way that he did to really justify these ongoing huge deficits. And he's kind of saying, well, the alternative, guys, is painful, damaging austerity. That's how I would read between those lines. And so clearly the thing we should take away from that is really that there's no real sense that the ANC is truly planning to change course here, to really adjust this budget to size, to cut it, to cut it to the appropriate size and to actually balance things out in a realistic fashion over the next couple of years to get balanced budgets. They just don't seem committed to that. And using that sort of language, starting to sort of oppose the idea of any kind of austerity or cuts or balancing budgets is speaking of a political sort of orientation and a sort of policy orientation that's just willing to do more and more of the bad stuff that we've been seeing over the last number of years. So I think all in all, I would say that's concerning.
Well, thanks very much, Russ. If you enjoyed this analysis, you might want to join our exclusive CRA client webinar today at 1:00 with myself, David Ansara, and Russell Lamberti. There are links in the description below where you can join our exclusive 30-day free trial, and you can access the webinar via that route. Until next time from the CRA team, take care.